Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. The current direction of US foreign policy remains uncertain. US assistance to Ukraine can be viewed both as a form of diplomatic pressure and at times as a potential abandonment of the country. Today we are joined by an expert in international relations to help us navigate this complex issue in light of the unpredictable nature of US political leadership and the distinctive personality of President Donald Trump. We welcome Edward Lucas, a senior advisor at the Centre for European Policy Analysis. Mr. Lucas, welcome back, TVP World. Thank you for taking the time.
Well, hello, Ashim. Nice to be back again.
Thank you. So, pause of American weapon supplies to Ukraine just happened today. Talk us through what that means, why it happened, and what the solution to it is.
This is adding injury to insult. It's just worth remembering in the last few days we've seen America vote with Russia and North Korea against its oldest and closest allies on a matter of war in Europe. We've seen the leader of an embattled American ally thrown out of the White House after being insulted because he dared to correct the US president and the vice president on numerous points of fact. Now we've also seen the Defense Secretary, Peter Hegseth, stand down American hostile cyber operations against Russia. And now we've seen this pause in the weapons delivery. So this is clearly not a couple of unfortunate misunderstandings or blips. This is part of a systematic reorientation of American policy in which Russia is an ally and Europe, I'm afraid, is now an adversary.
So, clearly, certainly in his first term, Trump was accused of being a Russian stooge, and many other similar labels were thrown at him. Is he simply proving that true?
Well, I think you could say there are different options. We can be sad, mad, bad, or glad about this, and it could be, you can argue, this is all just chaos. It's just wildly over-promoted, unimpressive people with completely contradictory ideas who are going to actually fail to get anything constructive done, and this love-in with Russia will fail like so many previous ones done, and it'll all be over eventually. One can say that it's actually genuinely mad. They really believe all this stuff, and they're trying to reshape the world and in sort of some kind of neo-Kissingerian way. Or you can say it's really bad that they really do want to hand Europe over to the Russians as some kind of inducement, some bribe to get the Russians to support them against China. And I'm actually not, it's all horrible. I'm actually quite glad, because I think finally Europe is getting its act together. And I said in a piece earlier this week, we should put a whacking great gold statue up in the heart of Brussels to Donald Trump as the father of modern Europe, and commemorate February the 28th as the day in which he finally rammed European decision makers together and got them to start making decisions.
Well, making decisions is one thing, Edward. Actually getting things done is quite another, as we know, with the European Union. Is this going to speed EU action in any way?
Well, I think it already is. We've seen Ursula von der Leyen come out with large lumps of money, at least in the headlines. We've got a rapid tempo of summits and other meetings. I'm working on this new so-called bomb bank, the rearmament bank, which has a very good chance now of going ahead, not least thanks to Poland's involvement in it, and that will raise initially tens and then hundreds of billions of euros to rebuild Europe's defence manufacturing capacity. And there's a lot more going on as well. So I think that we're still seeing too many words and not enough deeds, but the ratio is gradually shifting, and there are real deeds happening.
Well, there's time component to this as well, isn't there? Because, getting the infrastructure up and running for the production of armaments and so on, not only for EU countries, but also for Ukraine, is going to take a while, budget or no budget. Should the EU be importing more from countries like South Korea, for example, or elsewhere to fill that gap?
We should be scouring the world for military equipment, although it's worth remembering actually that Ukraine's military industry is now very well developed. What they really need is money, reliable power supplies and manpower in order to make the most of it. But Ukraine can produce most of what it needs inside Ukraine, particularly in terms of drones, which are now the most important piece of military equipment in this war. And I think we do have probably a couple of years before Russia's ready to test NATO in the Baltic states or somewhere like that. And we can get quite a lot done in those 2 years. I don't underestimate the difficulty, and you're absolutely right about time. If we'd done this 10, 20, 30 years ago, we wouldn't be in the mess we are in now, and hundreds of thousands of people wouldn't be dead. So there's no room for self-satisfaction on this. But I would much rather see Europe awake than Europe asleep.
No, I think most would agree with you on that. Now, what do you think is going through Putin's head as he's watching this unfurl?
Well, I think he's probably watching with delight what's happening in Washington, D.C. I mean, America, in the space of this administration, the space of less than a month, has managed to do more damage to United States soft power and to United States alliances than any KGB master spy would have ever been able to dream of doing in the past. So that's very bad. But I think he must be looking with some concern at the sort of awakening giant of Europe. And remember, Russia has an economy the size of Italy. And he's not just up against Italy, he's up against the Nordic, Baltic, Polish 9, and they alone have a bigger GDP than Russia, quite substantially bigger. Germany under Merz seems to be getting involved. France under Macron is talking a good game. Britain is back in from the cold. All those old arguments about Brexit seem to be disappearing fast into the rearview mirrors. Keir Starmer and other ministers turn up regularly to EU summits and are getting more and more closely involved. So I think there's always there's a sort of paradox here that the worse Russia behaves, the more eventually the West gets its act together to stop it, admittedly with some horrible bumps in the road along the way from the Americans.
Understood, but there is a difference, isn't there, between the way in which the EU is approaching this and the way in which Putin is approaching it. I mean, he's basically throwing bodies into the meat grinder and moving forward. It might be a few meters a day, but he's showing no signs of stopping. So by the time the EU gets their act together, it might be a bit too late for Ukraine, would you say?
Well, there is a danger. If it really takes root in Ukraine that they are alone and that defeat is inevitable, then at some point even the Ukrainian morale will break. But I don't think we're there yet. And I think, first of all, the Ukrainians have got quite a lot stockpiled, so they're not. It's not as if it's like turning the lights off. The West can step up, particularly by giving them money. And as I said, they're producing a lot of their own stuff. And they're also, don't forget, making substantial inroads into Russia's infrastructure with these extremely effective long-range drone and missile attacks. And those are only increasing as they get better at making these things and making more of them. So Russia's forces are having serious problems with fuel, for example. And I think there's plenty, we have agency here. We can do stuff. This is not written in stone. The only thing that is holding us back is our own political decision-making or lack of it. And the answer to that is to start making more decisions, make them better, make them sooner, and make them harder.
OK. Now, President Zelensky has actually tweeted out that, he's actually put together some concrete proposals for a ceasefire, stroke peace deal, naval and aerial activities, bombardment and so on, to stop, and in exchange of prisoners of war. Sounds fairly sensible to me. How do you think Putin and Trump are going to take that proposition?
Well, I remember that Putin's aims are not really about Ukraine. Ukraine for Putin is a symptom not the actual goal of the war. He wants to change the European security order. He wants American troops and all, in fact, outside troops removed from countries like Poland. He wants NATO to go back to its pre-1997 borders in terms of deployments. And so I don't think he's going to stop in Ukraine, even if the war in Ukraine stops. And that's a very important point to bear in mind, which the frontline states from Finland through to Poland are very well aware of. I think that there's a paradox, another paradox, that the Americans are always complaining the Europeans don't do enough. If the Europeans actually do something, and then the Americans complain and say, no, not like that. So if we get a proposal from Zelensky of some kind of ceasefire backed up by Western security guarantees, which I think could well work, and the White House says, as J.D. Vance did, we don't want some 20,000 troops in random countries that have never haven't won a war in 40 years. That is a very complicated message to the Americans to get across. And I fear the real point is the Americans don't want a lasting, comprehensive, just peace in Ukraine. What they want is a deep rapprochement with Russia. And they're willing to throw all sorts of allied interests into the pot in order to get that. And that is very tricky because it means we're dealing not just with Russia as an adversary, but actually also the United States.
Understood. I want to come to that relationship between the two, Russia and the US, in just a second. But talking about security guarantees, I mean, this has been something Zelensky's been asking for from the start. And some European countries, UK included, are stepping up to the mark. So if we were to get a ceasefire, what do you think of the idea of getting European boots on the ground in Ukraine to keep the peace? Whatever Trump wants.
Well, the more you know about military things, the more complications arise. First of all, this is not peacekeeping. Peacekeeping is the sort of lightly armed forces that you see in places like Lebanon, Cyprus, other old conflict zones, who are there really just as observers, and they will defend themselves if attacked. This is not what we want in Ukraine. What we want in Ukraine is a credible force that can support Ukraine and deter Russia from coming back for second helpings. Now, we just don't have the troops to do that properly. If we were going to do what we did in West Germany during the Cold War, we'd need 200,000 troops in Ukraine at any one time, with all the armour, logistics, intelligence, air defences and everything that goes with it, plus 200,000 troops training to go in, and then 200,000 troops recovering from having been in there. So that, and we just don't have that. Even with the United States, we don't have that. So forget that. We're going to have to do it some other way. And I think the answer is to do it with long-range fires and missiles and high technology, where we say to the Russians, if you attack, we will hit your cities, critical infrastructure, military bases with missiles that you can't shoot down. And we might add to that a financial element that the 300 billion in frozen Russian central bank assets is also a kind of financial hostage. So if there's any mucking around post-ceasefire, we immediately just take all that money. I mean, I would have taken the money anyway, but that adds another point of leverage. So the stuff we can do, it won't be as good. And the fundamental point is we are risking war with Russia. Don't forget that. If we put boots on the ground, Russia attacks them, what do? Do we send a press release or do we shoot back? If we shoot back, we're risking war with Russia. If we're going to send a press release, we might as well not bother to send them in the first place.
Right. Well, risking the war with Russia has always been the thing that's held many, many governments back since Russia's full-scale invasion. And yet, things have only got worse for other countries. But
exactly.
Edward Lucas, thank you so much for sharing your analysis with our audience. Do come and see us again soon. Have a good evening. Bye-bye. And that's all from us in this episode of World Talks.